Perfect. All right. So I'm going to share something insane that I learned when I first was researching this topic. Did you know that Americans, on average, spend 6 hours a day on their phone? Like, think about all the things you wish you had time for. Now, imagine how much time these little devices steal from us. Um, and here's something really embarrassing. This is a safe space. I will admit it to you guys. My average screen time wasn't actually 6 hours. It was 8 hours, like 8 hours, like a whole work day. I don't know how that was possible, but with that screen time, you know, app thing, it does measure everything. And like I was constantly scrolling, posting, comparing myself to others on social media. And I was just constantly feeling not creative enough, not attractive enough, not interesting enough, not productive enough. And the thing is, I knew it was unhealthy. I've read all the Atlantic articles, I've read the essays, I've read books on this. I tried app blockers, I've tried screen time limits, I've tried setting or locking up my phone in the other room, but nothing stuck. So the breakthrough kind of came when I actually leaned into mindfulness. That was something I kind of dabbled in my 20s, but wasn't consistent, I'll be honest. But once I started really leaning into mindfulness and took that practice a lot more seriously, my phone usage actually dropped from 8 hours a day to 2 hours a day. That's a huge drop. And that is without relying on app blockers and stuff now. So that's what inspired today's talk. And that's why I pitched this to Gareth. I just want to be clear. This isn't about hating on the internet. I love it. I have a tattoo to prove it. It's about breaking the compulsive cycle of mindless phone use and reclaiming our focus, our creativity, and our peace. And that's for everyone, no matter what your background. So here's the plan. Gareth will start us off with a short talk. We'll have a guided discussion between the two of us, and then we'll open it to my favorite part, which is Q&A. So Gareth, with 25 years of Zen and Vipassana study, he's the co-founder and a guiding teacher for Red Clay Sangha. Let's go ahead and give him a warm welcome. Yay!
Hello, everybody. So Havana is a young mum. I'm an older dad. I'm very pleased to be here with you and delighted that you can all be here this evening. As Havana said, this is not about throwing screens away and giving up. It's really, really useful stuff, and we use our screens in lots of interesting and important ways. Keep in touch with friends, stay in touch with what's going on in the world, share really important news and events that are very timely and we need to know about. So it's kind of an indispensable part of how we live our lives. This isn't about eliminating it, it's about changing our relationship with it. So, but the way we have interacted with it, it has become a very difficult cultural problem because of the way it is driven into our lives. There are mechanics about the way it works that make it kind of addictive. It's designed in that way. If you think about the marketing engines that drive all the platforms. So that's what we're looking at, how we can manage. Mindfulness is an incredibly wonderful and powerful tool that can help us with that. It's been around for at least 2,500 years. It grew up in the Indian subcontinent, showed up in Buddhism, and then in the Sanatana Dharma Hinduism with the Upanishads around 2,500 years ago. But there is archaeological evidence to suggest it's much older than that. If you go into Latin America, you can see little statues of shaman who are clearly in meditation postures that are a couple of thousand years old. I mean, it's a technology that helps us settle and helps us calm. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that technology works. And then we're going to practice it for a few minutes together. And then, as Havana says, we're going to get into the rest of the program guide. Havana and I'll have a conversation and then Q&A. So mindfulness fundamentally is about bringing our attention to bear on what we're doing. We People generally behave in ways that are around making themselves happy, but unless we look carefully at our behaviors, they come a lot of them from conditioning that is not a very skillful way of making us happy. So, for example, I'm an alcoholic. I haven't drunk in, I don't know, a couple of decades now, probably. But for much of my adult life, I was a high functioning alcoholic. And at that time, I was drinking because I didn't particularly enjoy my life. And the alcohol was a way of reducing the pain. It was just a really unskillful way because it made me miserable and lost self esteem, and it made people around me miserable. There are more skillful ways of dealing with it. So, mindfulness is about helping us bring our attention to bear on what we're doing so that we can examine it more closely, be more present with it, and make more skillful choices. It's something that is engaged in as part of everyday activity. So as we practice mindfulness, we develop the ability to be present as stuff's happening. We start to learn to tune into our body. So when something starts making us angry or irritated, we can feel the physical sensation. To me, it's kind of like a tightening of the chest. So we can feel that arising. So, ooh, there's that thing again. And we catch it before we react. So we then got a choice. I'm going to now shift and talk about meditation. These two are often conflated and really thought of as the same thing, and they're really not. They're very different. They do work very closely together, but they're very different. Mindfulness is about this being present and aware and intentional about what we're looking at. Meditation is the process of actually just stopping. It's just stopping. So with mindfulness, you can be aware, but if you're not making yourself stop, then the habit patterns can continue. So with meditation, if you think of it this way, so a story I like to say is about you're sitting and having a conversation with somebody, and there's an insect flying by. So if you're not thinking about it, and an insect's buzzing by, you just sort of flap around, and eventually you just swat the insect. If you're much more intentional and much more present, you will brush the insect and then say, "Oh," and then you'll come back to the conversation. If you start practicing meditation and you're actually sitting still and you're intentionally trying not to move, then your hand will go out to hit the fly and you'll realize what's happened, so you'll bring it back. And as you practice this, you'll start to notice that earlier and earlier, and you'll start to eventually just notice the impulse to move your hand before you've gone for the fly. And then you'll notice, so as you notice the impulse before you move, then you'll just notice the fly. And eventually one day the fly will just land on the back of your hand, and you'll look at it and you'll say, "Wow, that's the most beautiful creature. Those veins in its wings. It's got these beautiful iridescent purples and greens. It's beautiful." So that is kind of how meditation works over time. It causes us to notice our habits, intercept those habits before they manifest as reaction, and then slowly erode that habitual pattern until we shift and change our habits. And the mindfulness works hand in hand with that. The mindfulness is the day-to-day, moment-by-moment attention, so we see what's going on. The mindfulness is how we bring that alive in our lives. So these two really work together. And these, as most of you probably know, mindfulness and meditation are techniques that have been adapted by lots of different traditions and used in their own ways. It's what meditation gives rise in Christianity to centering prayer. Both meditation and mindfulness are used in a lot of therapy practices. So these are techniques that have got a wide acceptance as valuable techniques. As it relates to what we're talking about today, the challenges with the craving that happens around screens, if we can cause ourselves to notice the habit of grabbing the screen before it happens, then we have a chance of doing something different. If we are cultivating the skill of stopping, then we can just take that pause. We can just take that pause. Even if it's just a brief pause, because that brief pause is then the start. If we have this mindfulness practice and something comes up, we think, oh, I need to go check on this on the screen. Tell you a little story, a sidebar. Just before I came in here, I went and I sat for 15 minutes, which is, I sit for much longer than that usually, but it's just a short sit. And I realized as I was sitting, I felt, oh, this body's a little bit energized. And it was in anticipation of this call. So that just allowed the body to settle down. And as it was settling down, it's like, oh, I need to go check this. Oh, I need to go check that. No, I'm not going to because I'm sitting. If you're just letting the impulses run, they just run. If you're intentionally slowing down and stopping, then you're creating that pause. And that pause gives us a choice. So I think what I'd like to do now is just move into a short period of meditation. So let's just plan on meditating for about 5 minutes. What I'd like you all to do, you're probably all sitting in chairs. So what I'd like you to do is try and sit comfortably in your chair and sit in a stable pose. So ideally, sit up straight, get your feet flat on the floor, so feet underneath your knees sort of hips width apart. Rest your hands on your knees probably, or on your lap, but somewhere where they're still and comfortable. Sit up straight spine. And what I'm going to ask you to do is relax your eyes, either close them or half close them, and just follow your breath. Just try and keep your attention focused on your breath and notice what's going on, and most particularly what's going on in your mind. You'll find stuff comes in the body, and you might find itches. And if you find something like that going on in the body, notice it. Don't let the impulse drive you. So like my hand just went straight up and scratched my neck because I've got an itch. Don't let that happen. Notice the itch. Be thoughtful about it. And if you want to scratch the itch, make a decision to do it and then let your hand do it. So try and notice that with the body, but mostly notice the mind and notice what's going on in your mind. And you'll find an impulse, probably, since we're talking about it, to check your social media or to look at the clock and see how long we've got left before we come back together. Notice that impulse and notice that that impulse does not control you. Notice that you can just let that be and come back to your breath. Don't be forceful with the impulse, be gentle with it. Just open the hand of thought, if you will. Just be very gentle with that impulse. Just gently come back to the breath. If the impulse wants to stay there, just let it stay there because you're not going to do anything with it. You're going to come back and follow the breath. And let's try and just do that for 5 minutes. And in 5 minutes, I will ring the bell and we will come back together.
like 60-year-old. I like girls too. I like 60 girls. I love.
I hope you could hear the bell.
You can hear it.
Welcome back, everybody. So we're about to get into the guided discussion, but I have to note the noise at the end, the interruption, and the impulse. Each of us had some kind of impulse that arose there. Each of us knows what that was for us, but just making ourselves stay still and not reacting totally changes the game. Not reacting allows us to not identify with that noise, not identify with the need to do something about it. It's just a noise. The leaf blower outside in the yard across the street is just a leaf blower. It's just doing its job as a leaf blower, and it's fine. Oops, let me get my video back. It's fine until we go out to meet it. And in that case, the person, whoever it was who was making that interruption here, I'm very happy that I'm sitting in this sack of skin and bones and not with whatever suffering is in the person who finds gratification from that kind of behavior. That doesn't feel like a happy life to me. So choosing not to react to that is the same kind of thing as using these pauses to not react when our screens or our drive to use our screens comes up. Havana, you have a conversation to facilitate here.
Yes, I do. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us. And shout out to our moderators for helping us with interruptions and things. Yeah, I thank you for the lovely talk, Gareth. That was really helpful and a good reminder for me, even though I've been practicing and trying to take mindfulness a little more seriously. And I would also like to comment if at any point, just like I have already, have the tendency or the urge to check your phone while we're talking. Just like what Gareth said, just catch yourself, observe. It's okay if you do reach for it. Be gentle with yourself, but just like notice. Try to get into the habit of noticing when you reach for that because it's so habitual. Great segue into the first topic of our conversation, which is okay. And I'm sure a lot of people here can empathize with this, but I've always been so deeply ashamed and embarrassed at how compulsively I will check my phone. Like I will literally, this is literally what will happen. I'll scroll on Instagram. I check all my DMs. Okay, I'm done checking the DMs. I check my texts. Okay, I don't have any more texts. I check Discord. I check, Twitter or whatever. And even though I just checked everything and I cleared out all of my notifications, I'll put my phone down and literally sometimes within 30 seconds, I'll pick it up again. And I know like neurologically, I know like it's that dopamine hit. Um, it's that little bump of pleasure that we get, but it doesn't bring us anything. So like, what the heck is happening here from a mental and spiritual standpoint?
Well, it's great question, great topic. So there's two things I think that are probably happening, Havana. One is that dopamine hit. Yeah, you see somebody, your likes have just gone up by 5. Oh my goodness, people are reading this post and commenting on it. But the other thing, and I remember my daughter when she was younger, Facebook was still a new thing, and we were still trying to figure out what to do with it as her parents. And she would stay up till like 1 or 2 in the morning in her bed.
Oh man.
Checking on Facebook.
That sounds familiar.
It's the fear of missing out. It's not dopamine, it's FOMO, right?
Yes, it is.
Fear is a
Been there.
terrible, terrible thing, right?
Hmm.
Um, so the practice of mindfulness becomes not about the neurological stuff and understanding the who did what to whom kind of thing and the storyline.
Hmm.
The practice of mindfulness allows us to ultimately be present with ourselves.
Hmm.
Um, you said another thing when you just spoke. You said the shame of you're ashamed of, right?
Yeah.
This shame comes from the same place as the need to check social media.
Mm-hmm.
It's because you're checking the dopamine hit that we're talking about is validation from outside.
Hmm.
And the second one, the fear of missing out, is fear of something going on outside.
Mm.
And the shame is something to do with relationship with the outside. It's about not
Mm.
being happy with what's here. And mindfulness, the practice of slowing down and noticing these things, ultimately where it takes us as we slow down and we make these decisions not to engage,
Hmm.
the deep reason why we can make those decisions is comes back to the I want to be happy and realizing that engaging in those kind of ways is not going to make me happy. It's going to make a
Mm.
short-term fix, but it's not really going to cure what's hurting right here.
Mm.
And we start to become much more compassionate to ourselves
Hmm.
as we engage in this practice. And you're nodding, Havana, and I hope what that means is that's been your experience as you've engaged in this practice, that it
Yeah.
just naturally takes you to a place where, without realizing it, there is just much more compassion here. And it's compassion for everybody out there, but also for yourself. Does
Mm.
that feel right?
I think so. Like I remember early in my mindfulness practice. So I've been for everyone else, I've been practicing for about 2 years, and you mentioned the fly analogy. Like you
Hmm.
first notice the urge to swat it away, then you notice the urge itself before you start swatting, and then you start seeing how beautiful the fly is. For me, in the early days when I was trying to when I was practicing mindfulness a little bit more, I would lay in bed with my phone like this, and I would just keep scrolling. And before, I would be like completely mindless. Like I would blink, and then like 4 hours is gone. Over time, I started even catching myself as I'm scrolling, but it was almost like this little me yelling at myself, like, okay, you've been on Instagram Reels for 4 hours now. You have work in the morning. Put it down. Put it down. And it's just like, but then like over time, as you said, kind of like the fly analogy, over time, I'll now I'll I still have the compulsion, but I'll catch myself before I reach for it. Or
But
I'll ask myself, do I need to check that right now? You know?
the other question, so there's two sides of this. One is the practical,
Mhm.
right? But the other is,
Yeah.
I think you're happier, and I think you know you're happier. Well, I know
Yeah.
you're happier because for everybody else, Havana and I first met, I don't know how long ago, Havana, 10, 15 years ago, something like that, as in the business world. And we
Hmm.
had an encounter that lasted a few months, and then we parted ways. We just drifted apart. And
Hmm.
then we just came back together just a couple of
Yeah.
years ago as Havana engaged in this practice. So
Hmm.
you're clearly happier.
I
But I
am.
also
It's
have
like
more
it's
compassion as part of it.
yeah, absolutely. I think like even though my life is harder because of lots of obligations, I'm a new mom, got a lot of obligations. It's I feel lighter,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
So, so going back to something else that's going to be immediately helpful, because this is to
Hmm.
like set the stage of where this takes us. The
Hmm.
other thing that I'm pretty sure folks want to know is so what do I do? Now I know that you have a practice where, with at least a number of your platforms, you
Hmm.
just deal with them at the weekend and you don't deal with them during the week. That's a huge
Yes, I.
jump for most people to make that. So what you could do is you could just say, I'm going to take one day off a week,
Yeah.
or I can take one night off a week. Just start with
Hmm.
something that's manageable. There's somebody
Oh
else I
yeah.
know, a member of Red Clay.
Hmm.
She, in the last year, on two separate occasions, she's taken a month off, all
Wow.
all electronic communication, email and text as well. So just taken a month of complete fasting, if you will. So
Mm.
again, that's a big leap for somebody to make. But the peace that comes when we can build ourselves up and be able to do that
Hmm.
is wonderful. But just start in little bite-sized things.
Yeah, absolutely. I've tried, as I said, like over the past over 10 years plus, I've tried everything. I've tried deactivating, I've tried uninstalling it from my phone. Eventually, I find myself back. Um, right now, something that has helped me is like I'm not at the point where I want to delete Instagram because at least right now, I feel like I'm getting some value out of it. It's how I keep in touch with some of my friends. It's how I stay up to date on what they're doing. Um, what I found, as you said, I just don't let myself use it on the weekdays. I let myself use it on the weekends only. So I find that when the weekend comes around, I actually don't check it that much. And I think it's because the compulsion has been broken from me not compulsively checking it every day during the week. And so once that compulsion has been broken, even when you go back on there, it's not as like habitual. And also, I you talked about self-compassion. If on the weekends I do find myself scrolling and just looking at a bunch of Instagram reels or whatever, um, I'm like a little more graceful with myself. I'm like, well, this is a once in a week thing. So like it's not as bad. But yeah, so that's been something that's been really helpful. But then the mindfulness thing, it doesn't just help me with the phone, it helps me with eating, it helps me
That's
with
right.
like all kinds of stuff.
You're building that muscle. Um, so going back to the idea of start with something manageable. Um, Not only is that then manageable, but then couple that with something else, which is I'm stammering a little bit. Forgive me. So think of New Year's resolutions. A lot of people will say, I say a lot of people, I know some people say, I'm going to go to the gym every morning. I'm going to spend an hour at the gym every morning and I'm going to change my life this year. Well, of course, that's going to fail for most people because to do something that dramatic,
Mm.
you're taking half an hour to get there and back, an hour at the gym, and then a shower afterwards. You're changing your life dramatically. So something else has to give way for that.
Mm.
And it's going to resist. And then the new gym routine gets broken, and then you feel really awful and you lose a lot of self esteem and you fall back into old habits. And sometimes they get worse. So
Mm.
it's really, if you want to change habits, we need to be very thoughtful about how we change those habits. So
Mhm.
incrementally, start with something small, something we know we can manage. We could trick ourselves. So if you're going to take a night off a week, give the phone to your spouse or your friend or your kids or something. I mean, just, I
Mm.
can't touch it.
Mhm.
Go for a walk and leave the phone at home.
Mhm.
So create something, and that's then creating real space when you engage in it. So you have like a 3, 4, 5 hour stretch where you have to stop. The impulse comes up and you're not going to engage.
Mm.
So, to your point, Havana, you are then actually starting to shift those habits.
Mhm.
It's also important to be very compassionate with yourself when you do this,
Mhm.
because remember why we're trying to do this. We're trying to do this to make ourselves happy. If you're supporting a friend who's doing this and they slip, what are you going to do? You're not going to tell them you're worthless. You can't even do one night a week. How useless. You're not going to do that. You can say, oh
Mhm.
my goodness, I'm so sorry. I know how hard this is for you. Offer that to yourself as well.
Mm.
Be kind, be gentle.
100%. Um, it's another thing I want to bring up is, um, how these devices, it's such a weird paradox. They connect us, and yet they perpetuate loneliness, right? So I got some statistics here. According to the US Health and Human Services Department, 1 in 3 adults report being lonely or isolated. So back in 2021, 41% of adults in the US report have fewer than 3 friends that they could trust. In-person time spent with friends have dropped amongst people aged 15 to 24, about 70% since the 90s. So in-person hanging out. And single person households shot up from 13% in 1960 to now 30% in 2021. Social media is supposed to connect us. So what's causing these things to drive us apart?
Yeah. I'm going to make what I think is a really important distinction before answering your question, which is the distinction between loneliness and being alone.
Mm.
We are going to be alone.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of our lives we're going to spend time alone. That doesn't mean we're lonely.
Mm-hmm.
Loneliness is optional, and it's how we respond to being alone.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's two separate things going on here. One is the set of statistics you talked about, Havana, which are how more separate we are actually becoming. But the second thing is our discomfort with being alone.
Mm.
So we're just constantly surrounded by noise everywhere you go. It's like I had a dental surgery today, and the little clinic I was in, the room where they did the work, there's a big screen TV on the wall in front of me, and then they tip the chair back. There's a TV screen on the ceiling.
Oh no.
Yeah, I mean, we can't get away from it, and it's because we are no longer comfortable with being alone,
Mm-hmm.
and that then feeds. As soon as there's silence, we want to fill that silence.
Mm-hmm.
So part of this practice of stopping and noticing is recovering the ability to be alone, to be comfortable being alone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, really important.
Yeah, you know what? I think you just illuminated something for me just now, because like I find that before trying to be more mindful, uh God, this is embarrassing to say. Before I would brush my teeth, I would like try
Yeah.
to find a YouTube video to watch while I brush my teeth.
Yes.
Like, how long am I going to brush my teeth for? But I would spend more time looking for a video to brush my teeth, or find a video to watch while I eat. I would end up spending more time looking for a video than I would spend eating. And I think it was because I was afraid of being alone, like
Yeah.
just in silence. And I'm part of a subreddit called No Surf. So all of it, ironically, is about people trying to reduce their internet consumption and supporting each other through that. And I remember one of the questions that came up in the subreddit was, oh, well, what can I do for like 2 or 3 minutes at a time, like while I'm waiting in line, while I'm waiting around, like what can I do? And the top answer was like, what, you don't need to do anything for 2 or 3 minutes. Like, why do you need to fill every bit of time with something? So yeah, that's I never linked the two together with the fear of being alone.
Yeah.
So that's
So
interesting.
so what would and this is the way a lot of social media then feeds into our lives.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at it to fill that gap where we're afraid of being alone. People are
Mm-hmm.
constantly chasing to fill that gap. And it means we're not, when we do that, we're not actually present. We're not living our lives.
Yeah.
We're not really here living our lives. We're
Mm-hmm.
off watching a video or somebody else's conversation. So that's a really important thing that comes out of this practice of mindfulness. It's the slowing down, the little pauses that allow us to recover that ability to be alone, and in that aloneness, find ourselves. Then
Yeah.
from that place, we can then look at how we relate to the world differently.
Mm.
Without being in that place, we are just caught up in craving stuff to fill a hole. And our social media then ceases to be about relationships. It ceases to be about real connection. And it's about, it's like the Happy New Year text I got from somebody in the neighborhood. And there's like 40 people on it. And everybody's just replying, Happy New Year. It's like, what, to 40 people? It's like, I'm here. It's not a conversation. It's not a relationship.
Yeah.
You can take, it's like there's 40 people there, or, another one, somebody says, I'm so sorry to hear about your loss or whatever. And everybody just piles on. Yeah, I'm sorry too. Me too. Well, pick up the phone and call them.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, that's one way I've tried to have a more healthy relationship with my phone.
Yeah.
So if I see a post on Instagram, like let's say um someone's kid, someone had a birthday party for their kid, or someone just did like a 5K or something, instead of commenting, I'll just like text them directly or even call them. You could call them. Text them directly and say, hey, I saw that you did that 5K. Congrats. That's amazing. And like I let that open up a conversation. Like, how have you been? Like, have you been doing like 5K? Like, is this your first 5K? Like, it could open up so much conversation and strengthen those ties. And I feel like the reason why we feel so isolated is we're so afraid of reaching out and being vulnerable, and because there you do run the risk of rejection, right? Anytime you reach out and want to say something, they might not answer you, and that can be scary for some people or hurtful. But the alternative is you just stay isolated without even trying. Or worse yet, like I think that another reason why social media makes us feel isolated sometimes is like we are, we are with ourselves like every moment of the day, right? So we're experiencing our ups and downs, but then we're comparing to like people's highlight reels on
Sure.
social media. Like that's a very highly curated selection of images, videos, and things that they choose to share. But then, and of course, with especially algorithm driven content where all the best of the best. I know as an artist, I'll go on Instagram, I'll like look at some people's art, and I'm just like, well, why even try? Like, why? I'm a shitty artist. um, and it's like sad because like art is something I really enjoy and brings me like happiness and comfort. And I'm like hating myself as an artist by just looking at other art on Instagram.
Yeah, art should be, it's a great example because art should be, I mean, being human is about creating art in an important way. It's about engaging in that creative process. It's not competitive, it's not to be judged, it's just engaging in creativity for its own sake, expressing our humanity. And that really does get to this point of loneliness. If we don't have permission to do that, we're going to be lonely. And if we enter these platforms, which are in this highly curated, I mean, if you see these highly curated lifestyles, we come to that feeling we have to curate our own too. And it means we can't be who we are, and we can't display our own natural art. We've got to do, it's like the kids in middle school whose parents do their projects for them. Right? It's the same kind of culture. So being mindful, slowing down, we start to notice that's the nature of our engagement. We start to say, well, hang on. If I've got to be totally artificial to do this, I'm actually not that interested in it.
Yes, I've learned that a lot of the influencers, like they have the flashy cars, the big
Yeah,
mansions, all of that is financed.
yeah,
None of them own that stuff. Like they're
right.
borrowing someone's house, or they're renting, or it's an Airbnb. It's like There's a great quote, and I love it. It's sometimes the grass is greener on the other side because it's fake.
It's the modern day version of what was Dallas. It's my generation, not your generation, but it's like the big great soap opera of the time, where
Mm.
everybody had really big expensive cars and lived in really big houses and
Mm-hmm.
ran big businesses.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what most people are like, and it's not what my friends are like. So if we
Right.
start seeing that, then we don't have to have 600 friends on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. We can have like 50 or 100, and they're like
Mm.
real. And I know there are platforms that are actually around doing precisely that, bringing it back, making it real, and getting connected with real friends in real ways. But if we can start to see through this, which mindfulness, this slowing down, stopping, recognizing we have
Mm-hmm.
choices, recognizing all of our engagements are choices, and rebuilding habit patterns around that, then we can
Mm.
start to reground ourselves and be looking for relationships
Mm.
we really are, rather than this external validation, which is a lot of what is driving this engagement, right? And
Yeah.
it's very skillfully done by engines, corporate engines. I mean, all of these are driven by corporate engines
Mm-hmm.
that are, you got marketing VPs
Yeah.
whose compensation, very large compensation, is driven by creating platforms that create massive engagement and turn that 6 hours a day into 8 hours a day,
Mm-hmm.
drive ad dollars, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
that's what's going on. So it's not a surprise it works this way. But if we can use our tools, and mindfulness is such a powerful tool to break those habit patterns, then we can start to come back to building real relationships, and we can start to realize that our happiness isn't about creating a curated lifestyle and having people say, "Wow, you have such a cool lifestyle," when I know it's fake.
Mm.
We find happiness by being in real relationship and helping people. And we might have a friend who says, "Hey, let's all go along to this food shelter on Saturday." Or, "Hey, let's have a sandwich project. And let's have a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of people come to Red Clay in a couple of months and make a couple of hundred sandwiches." Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is where we find happiness, is in the connection and the service. Mindfulness helps us reground
Mm.
away from curated lifestyles and away from external validation.
Oh, yeah. That's a good reminder. And actually, it's another good segue into my next topic, which is
Well, good.
it's just flowing naturally.
I like doing that, Havana. That's great.
So sometimes when I scroll on Instagram or whatever platform, I might see like a toxic comment or a
Ah,
toxic post, something that just makes me so angry. And I've been guilty of taking the bait sometimes. Like, and it's frustrating because like I don't even know this person who's making me so mad, but sometimes it literally ruins my whole day. I know I shouldn't let it bother me, but I'll literally just linger on it. Like
yeah.
something I don't even know where this person is, what they look like and like worse, I might comment back, which is always just a spiral.
That's a
um
bad place to go. Yeah.
and especially with all the political turmoil and stuff, like I'm sure that's not going to be the last time we encounter those moments. But what can we do in those moments when something does make us angry?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to do, well, where we go is we pause.
Mm-hmm.
Don't react. Stop and take a breath. Everything starts. All of this work starts by just cutting off that immediate response, that habit response, that knee-jerk response. Pause, take a breath. And then if we can look at it differently, um, so the person who made that comment isn't doing it. They may be. That person who's making that comment is doing it from a place where they want to be happy too. You want to be happy?
Mm-hmm.
They want to be happy. They're just not being very skillful about it. And that's a
It's so hard though. That's so hard to like try to empathize with that person, especially if they're saying something like let's say homophobic, racist,
I
whatever.
understand. And I'm not going all the way. I'm just notice that. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
just know that.
Hmm.
And this is not to condone bad behavior. This is in no way to condone bad
Totally.
behavior. Um, but the skillful way of responding to bad behavior is not out of knee-jerk anger. It's about slowing down and then thinking, what is a skillful response? Because there are more skillful responses, right? Um, so what happens if you, in that pause, what happens over time is we realize that that anger is not me. What tends to happen is we let the anger flare up and we identify with that anger. I am angry. That's an identification.
Mm.
In Spanish, you'd say estoy enojado. I think that's right. Estoy enojado is angry, but you could say soy or estoy, and you'd say estoy because that's the impermanent form of the verb. In French, you'd say, I think it's je suis en colère. Je suis en. I am in anger. Not I am angry, but there's this thing called anger, and I'm in it.
Mm-hmm.
And a phrase that the Irish, as sort of an Irish vernacular, would say, anger is upon me.
Mm.
So all of these see anger as something that visits. So breaking that identification is a huge step here. And then that pause, we can break that identification. Thich Nhat Hanh, who some of you will know, he's a very well-known, passed away a few years ago, but he's a Buddhist teacher from Vietnam. He was actually nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He, among other things, would say how we respond to anger. Think of your anger as a little baby and hold it in your arms and cradle it, nurse it. Treat your anger with compassion. Don't identify with it. Recognize it as some form of suffering, of crying, and hold it and care for it. Because that's what it really wants. That's what will make it better. Giving it free expression won't make it better. Nursing it and caring for it, not denying it, but nursing and caring for it, will heal it. Right? So the first thing is to use our mindfulness to interrupt and shift our relationship with the anger. That then allows us to move from this knee-jerk reaction to a measured response, which is appropriate. It may be just, well, that's something I don't need to deal with it. Or it may be, well, that really is inappropriate. That's a comment out of prejudice that is harmful and I need to deal with that. You know, like in the grocery store where somebody's really rude to the woman in front of you who's wearing a hijab and they're just rude because she's Muslim. Well, you don't want to let that go. But you're not going to like get right in the guy's face. You know, there's a way of being supportive of the woman and letting the man know that's inappropriate and that you're not going to put up with that, which is not that immediate expression of anger. It's a more measured response.
That's a good example. Yeah. And I'll touch on one more thing I wanted to touch on, then we can open it for Q&A. But on that, like, it's so interesting, like the issue of identity that kind of ties into this stuff. Like, so for example, um, one of the reasons why I might be quick to anger, especially if I see something that I disagree with or that I see is socially harmful, is I might take it personally, right? I identify as a queer woman of color. And
Yep.
so if I see homophobic stuff, if I see misogynistic comments, it's just like, not only am I getting angry for myself, I'm getting angry for like that group or whatever, or just angry that
Yeah.
that ignorance is there. Not only that, however, I do feel like in this day and age, it's almost like you have to rush to like pick your stance on something. Um, Especially with a lot of social media movements, like a lot of people will demand, like, well, you haven't said anything, what's your stance on this? Like that means that they're anti this or pro that.
Right.
And there's this need to stay, I want to stay informed on current events, but it's also, I sometimes feel this pressure to vocalize a stance on
Yeah.
issues too. um how do I navigate that?
Yeah. So you've raised two different issues there. I'm going to deal with
Mm-hmm.
them separately. One is the identity,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then the other one. Um, what was the second thing you said? I've lost it.
Picking a stance.
Yes, the
Mm-hmm.
the urgency of taking a stance, the pressure to do something immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so sorry, I just got something stuck in my mouth there. So the first one, I'm going to deal with something basic and then come back to the more specific point as it relates to the categories of identity you're talking about. But
Mm-hmm.
identity, taking a role, assuming a role, can be very, very useful in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But getting caught on identity can become a problem. Assuming an identity and like saying, this is what I am, can be a problem. So, for instance, in my life, I'm a spouse, I'm a father, I'm the guiding teacher of Red Clay, I'm a former businessman. I'm lots of different things, but I'm not all of those to all people. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
spouse to my wife, I'm a father to my kids, I'm a kid to my parents, right? And those roles have to be used in the right places. If I take those on as identity, it kind of gets in the way. And even with my wife, um, I'm a partner, I'm a friend, I'm a lover, I'm a help and a guide sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a student at other times when I go and I ask her for help, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
these are all different roles within the same relationship. So this thing of identity becomes really complicated. And the problem isn't with using the role skillfully. The problem is when we become over-identified. I'm using that word sort of twice there, but it's when we become over-identified with the identity. If we say, this is who I really am, because I'm none of these things. I'm a straight white guy, right? Overeducated, privileged in lots of different ways. But in reality, I'm Gareth. I'm just an ordinary human being who suffers just like everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So bringing that humility to bear around and holding our identities is really important. So yes, as a queer woman of color, those are very useful. They're very useful identifiers because they allow you to relate to other people in any one of those groups and find camaraderie, find support. And that's really, really useful.
Mm-hmm.
And they allow you to use language around those categories to explain to others about behaviors of prejudice, behaviors afflicting minorities, and so forth. Also, really, really useful.
Mm-hmm.
But when we get stuck in owning that, becoming that, saying, this is what I am, then we find ourselves building suffering for ourselves and moving more into reactivity rather than slowing down and being skillful in our responses.
Mm. Yeah, it's it it makes me think of like how amongst like other Americans and peers, I have the identity of Asian American,
Yeah,
but if I was over in Vietnam, Asian doesn't make sense,
right.
right? It like I would be more an American to them.
Yeah.
Like so these labels and roles are very relative and not fixed, like you said.
And it's not to diminish their importance and their
Yeah.
utility. Absolutely not, because they really, really are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, the fluidity is an important way of looking at it. Yes.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
The other thing
Um,
you said,
mhm,
which I want to spend a minute on, is
mhm,
the culture we have of instant response. If you
mm,
don't like respond immediately, then it means you must be against this or for this. Or um,
mhm,
we live in a culture that, in many ways, is not a healthy culture. And driving people to make these instant decisions to pick sides
mhm,
is not healthy. Jesus is a great example, Jesus Christ, of picking a third path.
mm,
One of the famous stories out of the Gospels is the adulteress, and it's a part of it's a horrible story because we got the adulteress and she's going to be punished, and the man who was also involved in adultery isn't even on the scene. So I mean, there's that. So forgive me that because it's a very sexist story. But there's a really important point here that comes out of it, which
mhm,
is the rabbis bring this woman and then they throw her on the ground in front of Jesus, who's sitting there deedling on the sand, and they say, "She's an adulteress. Penalty
mm,
stoning. Are you going to throw? Are you going to stone her?" And he pauses and he says, let the person among you who is without sin cast the first stone." Now, it
mm,
was a trap because if he was to throw a stone, he'd be violating everything that he was standing for. If he doesn't throw the stone, then it means he's violating the Jewish law, which he's also saying, "I'm here to uphold." So it's a trap.
mm, mhm,
Whoever's without sin, throw the first stone. It's a different answer. He's
mm,
not being caught by the paradigm. And there are other examples in his story. Buddha's approach is a different approach in many ways, but fundamental and very similar in others. And Buddha taught the middle path. He taught by the middle way. So avoiding these extremes, existence and non-existence, self-gratification, self-mortification. There's lots of versions of it. But he said, I'm not going to get caught by extremes. I'm going to choose a different path. So allowing ourselves to get caught in the trap of you have to pick a side is just perpetuating the problem. And it's very difficult to not do that. It's profoundly countercultural.
mm,
But that is the move here. It's to find, is there a way? It's like what's going on in Israel and Gaza right now. It's going on in Gaza, but with Israel and Gaza. Um, I know Muslims and Palestinians, and I know Jews who are simply against the war,
mhm,
the violence. They simply want the killing to stop. They're not picking a side. They just want the killing to stop.
mm,
And many of the Jews I know who take that posture, um, they find their position within the Jewish community very difficult because
mm,
it can be very polarizing. But they're very clear. I'm not picking sides. I just want the killing to stop. Let's all come together, have a ceasefire, and stop the killing. So it's countercultural, but it's finding that way to find the compassionate move
mm.
that works with one's own heart.
Yeah. And now I uh I want to open up to Q&A because I'm sure people have questions. But to piggyback off of that, I remember something that you mentioned weeks ago was, like hurt people, right? Like people will hurt others because they're suffering. So wishing loving kindness and happiness and freedom from suffering benefits everyone. Right? All right, with that, I would like to conclude the guided discussion and open it up for Q&A. So we'll do this a couple ways. If you're a little shy and don't really want to speak up, you can post a question in the chat. You can also click the raise hand button. So that is somewhere on Zoom. If you click on more, no, wait, where is it? I forget. I
It's
always
like
forget.
that, isn't it?
Oh, React. Yeah. If you click on React, you can choose to raise your hand or you could just speak up. We'll kind of play it by ear here. What does this bring up for people? Clay. Clay and then Pat.
Um, it seems like the core teaching of this particular discussion is that the technology itself is not the problem. It's
Mm.
the skillful and unskillful use of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have amazing technology, and as a blind person, it's what gives me an even footing. Uh,
Mm.
you know, there's so much more accessibility these days with the technology that we have, and with self-driving cars around the corner, that would virtually eliminate the last biggest barrier to people who are blind, their independence. Yet we have people who are terrified of it for many different reasons. Um, and they probably have very good reasons. But the idea I think that we're trying to hit on here is that, you know, the social media and the use of devices is not the problem. It's our approach to it. It's our displacement of identity and attachment onto it that creates problems for us. And I guess my question is, when we engage with this technology, how do we know the difference between when we're reacting to it and responding to it? Because I think that's kind of the key difference of understanding when we're acting skillfully and unskillfully.
It's a great question, Cliff. Great question. Um, I'm going to comment on something you said before answering the question. You talked about how technology, the technology we have with self-driving cars, is giving you so much more of a level playing field, and the car piece will eliminate the last part of it. So that's how technology is helping. I'll add that if we shift our relationship to the technology, that's another way of removing the barriers. Because if we shift from this displacement of identity to realizing, to coming back to our humanity and connecting with other people as human beings and seeing suffering, there'll be a lot more of your neighbors who just offer to drive you. That social fabric starts to come together in a different way if we shift out away from unhealthy relationships with social media. So there's that too. The answer to your question is we feel it in our bodies. As we start to become more mindful, I talked earlier about how when we become more present and aware, something like the anger that Havana talked about, we can feel that. I feel that as a tightening of the chest. I feel it as something rising, and it's a tightening of the chest. There's something kind of comes across the face too. There's like, you can feel it as red. We feel it, and if we allow ourselves and we slow down, we can feel it in our bodies, and we can recognize that some of our responses, our reactions, are not healthy. They're not going to help us be happier, and they're not going to help other people be happier. And we can feel the opposite too. If we've slowed down and we start to feel a connection with the suffering of the other person, with what's really going on, and then something more gentle comes out of the heart, and we can feel that it's coming from a different place. And so how we're responding is a different response that comes from a different place in our body. And we just naturally feel that shift in energy. And if we're just caught up being driven by external phenomena, then we're letting the phenomena naturally suck out of us reactions. If we slow down and shift it and allow us to pause and stop and watch what's coming up before we allow it to manifest, we can start to notice the difference in feeling of these different directions of response.
Thanks for the question, Clay. Pat, you had your hand raised. Oh, Pat, you're on mute, Pat. Pat, you're on mute.
There we go.
Mhm.
This may be a little off track, but one of the things that I know, and it goes beyond social media and scrolling and things like that, is that as humans, we are always seeking out new stuff. We're always seeking out something that sparks something in us. And by continuously looking for stimulation, we become addicted to those things. It's one of the problems that people used to complain about children in television and children who do a lot of gaming and so on. They move the games and the scrolling and the things on the internet move so fast. Your brain actually literally brains have changed in order to keep up with that, to process it that quickly. I remember taking a film class and learning how much slower the pace of films was before like 1970, and then it began to really, really pick up. And today we can't sit through a film that moves that slow. It's really hard. Um, and that's one of the reasons why it's so addicting. So sometimes you really do just have to turn it off and shut your eyes because it's just too much, right? But that's one of the ways you train yourself to back away from it. It's to just shut your eyes.
Your first point, Pat. Yes, we naturally. I mean, we're explorers. That's the neofrontal cortex turns us into really curious creatures, and we do lots of interesting and novel things, and we're very creative. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's everything to celebrate about that. Everything to celebrate that. But that's only a part of who we are. And this move to practice mindfulness brings the pause, it brings the stop, it brings becoming comfortable with silence. Yes, we explore new things, but a lot of the most creative and wonderful exploration actually comes out of silence. If you get a bunch of people together, if you want to have a creative meeting, then probably the most wonderful thing you can do for the group is say, okay, we're going to meditate for 15 minutes before we start, because that allows everybody to settle down. And everybody's then coming from a much calmer place rather than bringing all the baggage of their stories to the room. They're coming from a calmer place and creativity can emerge. So yes to creativity, yes to exploration, yes to excitement. It's wonderful stuff. We just need to couple that with this practice of mindfulness, this practice of slowing down, this practice of being comfortable being alone, which is exactly what you said at the end, Pat, which is we've got all this wonderful, exciting stuff we engage in, and it can be great fun. It can be very stimulating and very engaging for folks together as well as for us alone. And then we turn it off.
I have to say, something just came up in my head. Now it slipped away. Um, it's exhausting, is what it is, to move that fast continuously. It's like people who are, it goes hand in hand with people who are completely stressed between, work-life balance and trying to manage everything at once. It's exhausting.
And so, yes, I find a lot of it exhausting too, but I'm 60 years old and I was raised in a different world. So I don't know how much of that is because of that. My kids, I suspect, don't find it quite as exhausting. Go on, Pavana.
I did have something to add because I did grow up with the internet. So I've been exposed to this kind of like high octane, high speed content for a lot longer. And I even find it exhausting, even though I'm used to it. And like you said, Pat, I wish I was a film snub. I'll watch old films and I just can't stand how slow it is. But that's kind of part of the habitual nature of like, that's not the type of content I'm used to. Right. So I am used to like the more flashy, more fast paced content. But then it causes a problem even with someone my age where it's like really hard for me to just sit still. I have the urge to like clean something, check something, text someone. Like, so I have to like catch myself, and it's almost like this like frenetic ball of energy, and I just have to like slow it down. So it's exhausting as well to me, Pat. Just maybe in a slightly different way.
What I, where I'm trying to go with this is to say I'm trying to avoid judging any of the ideas of what's good, what, any of this kind of behavior. The point is, we're all caught in our own worlds. We're all living in our own worlds, and all of us realize that if we slow down, that much of what we do actually isn't making us happy. That we are reacting in ways that are going to be unhealthy to ourselves and to others, and we're caught up in habit patterns that induce or are part of craving. But practicing mindfulness, wherever we are, whatever we're doing, practicing mindfulness is allowing us to slow it down enough to start noticing those things. And the stop of meditation allows us to actively interrupt those habit patterns. And incrementally, we can start to change that. And it's the move here isn't to say, oh my God, it's all too fast. Let's just go do this instead. It's to say, I'm just going to not engage in any of that on a Tuesday night. And if that's really good, then you say, I'm not going to engage Tuesday nights and Thursday nights. You had a couple of other questions, so I'll shut up.
Yes. To Daryl and then Ella.
No, it's fine. Gareth actually answered it with that. Yes.
Perfect.
So, thank you.
Ella, go ahead.
That's great. I had a question kind of relating to sometimes when I have a lazy day where there's not a lot of things to do, where maybe I would be more able to have those moments where I can just take a break and be mindful. Those lazy days are like my worst days where I feel really sad. And when I'm like, well, I have so many things to do, I have a full schedule, I'm often really happy because I'm doing it with people I love. Do you have some advice on like a way to find balance between those?
Yeah. Thank you, Ella. That's a great question. It's great to see you, by the way. So glad you're here with us. The practice of mindfulness isn't about goofing off. This isn't saying go just take a day and nap. This is about intentionally slowing down and paying attention. And there is a time and a place for just taking a break and saying, I'm overwhelmed, I need to take a break. I'm just going to go to the beach for 3 days and I'm going to leave everything behind. I'm going to do nothing. I'm not going to check with anybody. I'm just going to goof off and sleep 12 hours a day. There's a time and a place if that's what our body and our minds need. But that's not what this practice here we're talking about is. This is much more about taking little slices during the day. So take a 5-minute, Thich Nhat Hanh had a practice at Plum Village, which was the monastic community he created in the south of France, where periodically during the course of the day, he'd have somebody ring a bell. And when a bell was rung, everybody, didn't matter what they were doing, they could be in the middle of a conversation, cooking dinner, making a pot of tea, didn't matter what they were doing. Everybody would stop and just take 3 breaths. Stop, take 3 breaths. So this practice of mindfulness is much more about that. It's about living life and noticing what's going on, taking those pauses and those stops periodically. And if you're looking at how to integrate mindfulness into your day in that way, what I would suggest, rather than taking a whole day off like that, to start with, is just meditating for 5 minutes every morning. And if you miss a morning, that's fine. Give yourself a lot of self-compassion. But just, you're training yourself to stop and pay attention, not training yourself to check out, which is what can happen if you take a day off. Am I getting to your question, Ella?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think you are. Yeah.
Hey, Eugene.
So can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Uh, yes, I have a question to Gareth. You mentioned that slowing down, and you slow down, and eventually, like you said, you can observe your impulses and you can make a decision
Yep.
to act on that impulse or not. So this is what I wanted to ask. So it still involves choice.
Mhm.
That means you evaluate, you compare, and you make a judgment. That means you're not really in meditation, because if you make judgments, you are attached to objects. How to explain this?
Yeah. In the extreme, what happens, like at the end of all of this, what happens is that pause makes room for an intuitive response that actually isn't the result of judgment. It simply comes from feeling compassion. So, for instance, there would be if you're walking along the street and a little kid walks out in front of a car, you wouldn't think twice. Well, most of us wouldn't think twice. We'd just jump in front of the car and throw the kid aside to save the kid's life. That's just what you do. That's just a compassionate impulse. So we're headed in that direction of just opening up intuition and natural connection. Along the way, yes, there's in old woodcraft where people didn't use nails, you used wooden pins to knock things together. You work with smaller and smaller pins. So there's a phrase of using a peg to knock out a peg, where you're using a narrower gauge peg to knock out a bigger gauge peg. Our practice is the same. Yes, we start by putting ourselves in a place where we do make judgments, but they're more subtle judgments, so they're coming from a place of greater awareness, more discerning awareness of what's going on. And as our awareness becomes more subtle, what we're using as the basis for making those decisions becomes ever more subtle and ever more directly connected with helping people in their suffering, with less ego in it and much more compassion in it. And it just moves in that direction as discernment increases and improves.
Thank you for that. I have a few more minutes for some questions, if people have them. I'll ask a question if no one else has one. Um, this is kind of similar to something Clay said, which is how technology can help aid us, especially if you're in a marginalized group. I know, again, as someone who doesn't identify as queer, uh, who is an Asian American who grew up in the suburbs of Georgia in the 90s, the internet was like, I mean, that was the only place I felt seen. I felt belonging. I didn't I could find other people who were like me, and I could make sense of some of the questions that were kind of coming up for me during that time as a teenager. So in a way, like the internet and of course as a medium, like our devices can be a door to that sense of
Yes.
belonging and community. So like how do I balance that, or like how do I make more meaningful connections through it? Basically, like I'm not gonna give up my phone, but how can I have a more like fulfilling relationship with my phone, if that makes sense?
I don't think you can have a more fulfilling relationship with your phone,
Mm-hmm.
but you can use your phone to have more fulfilling relationship with people.
Mm.
Um, and the practice of mindfulness, which is what we're talking about today, allows you to be more present, be more aware of how you are engaging with your phone.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not engaging in the example you gave, where you're talking with a bunch of teenage peers with
Mm-hmm.
the troubles of a queer Asian woman of color growing up in whatever that would be the 90s in this country, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you're not getting arbitrary information from a computer. You're dealing with real people. So it's finding a way to engage skillfully with the technology. And mindfulness allows us to slow down and not get caught up in the wrong things and really make sure we're tuned into what matters, which in the case you gave is that human connection with somebody who relates to you and with whom you can relate.
It's beautiful. All right, last call for questions. Any closing things you want to say before we conclude?
For your closing remarks,
Yes.
I will. Well, if anybody has any questions, you know how to get a hold of Havana, so I'm available if anybody does want to get a hold of me at any time. I would just encourage everybody to take gentle steps with this. There's no like sudden silver bullet here. It's just take gentle steps. Meditation and mindfulness, they're different things and they work really well together. Meditation, you bring your mindfulness into meditation. So it's a mindfulness meditation practice of this paying attention while you're meditating. But the meditation is training the stopping. Meditation is training you to stop, slowing things down so you can see more clearly and actually training you in stopping. So I just encourage folks to try just take it on a 5 or 10 minute meditation practice. Even, start small. 5 minutes, pick a time in the week that works for you, maybe Tuesday mornings before you go to work, but pick a time and just see if you can get some peace out of just this little piece of meditation and see where that takes you. And try not to be unkind to yourself when you make mistakes, when you get caught up in your habits, but try and notice them and try and just create the pause. Just try and create a pause and take a breath. I'll give you one other thing to take away. There is a practice of a one breath meditation, and it is available for us all anytime. And it's something that can just train us in this pause. So anytime you can be at a stoplight, you can be sitting at a meal table when there's a bunch of noise going on the other side of the room. There can be some kids screaming over here. It can be an argument at a football game. You just, instead of engaging or getting upset, you just go, one breath. And there you are. It's just a one breath meditation practice.
I suspect I'll probably need to resort to that a lot. Well, thank you so much, Garrett. This was so helpful. And everyone, thank you so much for the great questions. One more thing, if you enjoyed this and want to learn more about the concepts we talked about today, we have an Intro to Buddhism session on February 2nd at 2 o'clock. So to make it easy, it's 2 at 2. So if you want to click on that meetup link there, you'll find more information on where you can join us and when that will happen. Basically, it'll just go through a lot of the basic concepts. And Buddhists don't really care about converting other Buddhists. So it's open to everyone. I really feel like there's a lot of great practical stuff in there with mindfulness, and this can extend to anything, not just phone usage, but like eating, dealing with hardships, dealing with friends and family and stresses in life. So check us out if you want to. We also have a website for Red Clay Sangha. If you want to, if you can't make it to 2 at 2, you can check out all the other events at Red Clay Sangha. And then I will send an email out whether you came from Eventbrite or Meetup. I'll send a email with a recap and then a couple resources for you to check out. Thank you, everyone. And I know it's late, so have a wonderful night. Get some rest. And thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Havana, and thank you, everybody. It's been a lovely evening.